Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. Welcome back, everybody, to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and I'm actually here live for the first time in the Davis County Library, Davis County Public Library, and more specifically in the Kentucky Room. Now, I have a guest here, Barry Duvall, who has written a great book called United We Stand, Divided We Fall, How the American Civil War Impacted Muhlenberg County. Now, we've not done a lot of history about Muhlenberg County, so I've actually talked to Barry here, and we're going to be doing a lot more here, hopefully soon. Mr. Duvall, thank you for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, it's an honor to be here. We are live on YouTube, Facebook, and we do have some people here in the audience watching. If you have a comment, anything like that, feel free to chime in. We're also on the Davis County Public Library Facebook feed as well. So you can send comments. We'll try to answer them the best we can. As long as it's not too off the wall, we should be able to manage, I think. But anyway, I always like to start off, Mr. Duvall, with the connection to Kentucky. What's your connection to Kentucky and Muhlenberg County as well?
Well, I always look at Kentucky as, I kind of start with the question, why would you go anywhere else? It's home. I was born in Muhlenberg County, like my father, and generations before. Been there since the pioneer days. Most of my ancestors are Muhlenberg Countyans from the early days. When I was a child, I noticed I had an interest in history. And as I grew, the interest also grew. And probably age 14 or 15, I started wanting to do genealogy work and try to figure out how I was tied to this whole big picture. Mm-hmm. And from there, I fell in love with Muhlenberg County history.
Mm-hmm. And that's typically, the passion starts when we're young. Me personally, back when I was going to the forts in Harrodsburg, Boonesboro, they didn't have a fort for Fort Logan at the time, but since then they've actually got a pretty good, well-constructed fort. They're trying to get it all complete. Mm-hmm. But it does start young. Mm-hmm. The book is very extensive, a lot of good research. The obvious question is, how long did it take you to write? But let's talk about what got you into this book. What was the beginnings? How long it took you, all those things, because there's a lot to it.
Well, the basis of the book things always interest me. I used to do
Mhm.
Civil War reenacting when I was able. I have Parkinson's disease
Mhm.
now, so there's a whole lot of things I cannot do. So I spend a whole lot of time reading and researching. I call it good therapy, and it's good, clean therapy.
Yeah.
So in my collection alone, I have around 2,000 books.
Wow.
Several of those are unpublished manuscripts, things that have been handed down to me
Mhm.
from historians before me, Mr. Gail Carver, Miss Joanna Fox, people like that. And among that, I have binders full of letters written by General Don Carlos Buell. I got binders of letters from Muhlenberg County soldiers during the Civil War that they would write back home.
Mhm.
And I used to pull those out on occasion, read one, and just be amazed at the story that would be unfolded before me. And I thought I needed to share those. So I had it in my head that I would take those sometime, just make copies of them and say, here's a book. It's a book of Civil War letters written by Muhlenberg County soldiers. Well, I thought, well, maybe I needed to go through and write a summary of these letters. So I started doing that. The summaries I started doing other research, pulling out some other texts, some things published, some unpublished. And I'm finding that the sources are numerous, but none of them are complete.
Mhm.
You can find a little bit of information about your county, or for example, Muhlenberg County soldiers in this book. And then there's one over in this book. And then I've got these letters. And before long, my notes were spread out everywhere. And I thought, well, maybe I'll create a book from this. Do the chronological story, do the troop movements. A friend of mine said, why don't you add a table as you find soldiers' names, create a table of soldiers from Muhlenberg County? I said, well, let's have a criteria. It'll be, you've got to be born, lived, or died in Muhlenberg County. And that's all well and good. And there's no one source for that. So I started putting these names on a list. I thought, well, it's easy enough. I'll add their birth, death dates, where they were born, where they died,
Yeah.
a little bit about their service. Before long, those are turning into little biographical sketches. I got to say, Cass Cobb, a young historian in Muhlenberg County, I pitched it her. She said, let me do some of the military research for you for these soldiers. And she was sending me these blocks of soldier movements and stuff for each individual soldier. I took that, combined it with the genealogical information, and created all these sketches. And it turns out that some of them are a few lines long, and then some of them are a few pages long.
Mhm.
And I thought, 2 books. I've got the Civil War history, then I've got my soldiers book
Yeah.
now, which was supposed to just be an appendix to the first book.
Mhm.
But it turned out to be quite a large book. My son decided whenever he took the project on, I kind of shelved it. I didn't think I could finish it financially, mentally, physically.
Mhm.
And my son, he runs a little place over there, and there's a shameless plug called Sip and Spin.
Mhm.
And he said, Dad, I want to put your book on sale in the shop. And I said, well, I'm really not able to do it.
Yeah.
So he sat down and worked out the artwork, the details, the layout,
Mhm.
and all that, and made one book. And that's how we got the final product.
There you go.
So very
Yeah.
proud of that.
Yeah, well, it's a real, treasure for Muhlenberg County for sure, and even Kentucky as a whole, because there's a lot of information. We'll talk a bit more about the soldiers and so forth in a little bit, because there's a few questions I have for you for that. But the book is about Muhlenberg County in the Civil War, and that's kind of what you're here to talk about. Where to begin? Let's talk about Muhlenberg County in the Civil War. Where do you start at? Because the Civil War, a big occurrence, of course, it's still talked about today, still debated today, for many reasons. But where do we start at?
Well, the way I looked at it, as I did my research and some understandings I'd previously learned from other historians, you always learn in school about Kentucky being neutral, and we're trying to stay out of this and all that. It's not that clear. It's not that clear cut. One of the things to write the book, I had to start getting in my mind what it must have looked like then. Think of yourself as being on a deserted island. Information was slow moving. Opinions were slow to form. And if people did have opinions, they usually weren't heated in their discussions. Some maybe, but rarely. As the war approached, and we'll talk about slavery some too, as the war approached, Muhlenberg County was kind of dumbfounded by the whole thing, blindsided, if you will. And it's not a line. People always say, this is the North and this is the South. That's not true.
Yeah.
As in things that are happening today, houses, this house could be a northern sympathizer, and this one could be southern.
Yeah.
And within the house, you could have mom and dad could be separated on their opinions, and the children could be separated on their opinions. But it really hadn't come to a head yet, and as the war approached, people did start forming some ideals on what they thought, and but it wasn't really a clear issue until the shots were fired.
Yeah.
And then people had to make decisions.
Yeah, you have to start choosing sides.
That's right.
You talk about the information coming in, and nobody's making TikToks about at the time or sending anything in like that.
It's James. It's funny you mentioned that because I try to use that perspective. When you're reading about this history, you've got to eliminate all of that out of your mind because today we have information available in just seconds. Boom, there it is. These people are sitting waiting, and if the information came, it may or may not, it may not be true, just like in seconds.
Yeah.
But if that's the only thing you've heard for 2 weeks or a month, and it's just an odd situation.
Yeah, and oftentimes I think with the Civil War, people want to generalize and make it all just this or that. But when you get down to, especially when you get down to the individuals, like you said, house to house,
right?
It's going to be different. People are going to have different opinions about each little thing, even like they do now today.
That's right. That's right.
So it's not as cut and dry.
No.
As people want to say. But in your book, you mentioned that the governor of Kentucky wanted to stay neutral out of it. And that was kind of that is kind of the thought that people have today, and not that that was true, that Kentucky is the state, or I guess the political people of the state wanted to stay as neutral as possible. But then a guy by the name of John P. Jack Thompson.
Oh yeah,
he up and says, "I'm picking a side."
Jack Thompson was from Owensboro, from Davis County, and he was one of the early ones. I think he actually established one of the first companies of soldiers, and he put them together for the most part here in this area in Davis County. And he did that in May of 1861. And just shortly thereafter, the next couple of days, when they left Owensboro, they moved to Muhlenberg County and did some recruiting in South Carrollton. And that I didn't go into a whole lot of detail over Jack. He's a descendant of a Revolutionary War soldier. We know that he's deep rooted in Owensboro, Davis County, and in the book being about Muhlenberg. But I did have to reach out and connect with him because all the areas, if you're in a region or let's just say Western Kentucky, they kind of overlap. And it's interesting the characters that would move in and out of, let's say, like he did in Muhlenberg County. And so I had to touch on that, and quite an exciting person to follow. But he started a group that is known as the Dixie Guards. And but it had some Muhlenberg County men that served in his unit. And from there, they went to Richmond and fought.
Oh, okay. In the Battle of Richmond, yeah. Well, I just saw, whenever I was reading, I thought that was a pretty good or pretty funny little. The governor says, "Stay at home, men. Don't pick a side. We're neutral," and just almost instantly, I'm going.
It's not as fresh on my mind, but McGoffin was actually more of a Southern man himself. He even had his own opinion, even though politically he wasn't supposed to share that. So. His act of neutrality was a whole lot more of a standoff because he didn't want to be overrun with Union people, and he didn't want to pick a side.
Basically,
But he had a side, like everybody did. He had an opinion.
He was being a good politician.
That's right. That's right.
So as you mentioned, house to house kind of went, but Muhlenberg begins to pick sides, or the people in Muhlenberg County, to an extent.
For the most part, yes.
Yeah. And as far as those families go, I mean, I guess as far as how did it? I mean, people just said, you know what, I'm South, I'm North, I'm neutral.
It's interesting because you kind of got to see the lay of the land too. I mean, the areas that were most populated were along the river still, except for Greenville, which was inland. You had Paradise, you had Kinslow's Bluff, which is now over near Central City. You had South Carrollton. Those were the more populated areas, and then you had Greenville. So those were the things that are happening. And as they started dividing up, you had your Confederate factions, and the groups that there were no companies of Confederates that were formed specifically in Muhlenberg County, but they joined other companies, other regiments in the end. And then there was some recruiting going on for the Union Army there at a place they called George Prentice. Was where they did a lot of recruiting, and some of them came as far as Owensboro.
They called it George Prentice.
George Prentice
after the newspaper guy.
Man. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. They actually had a recruiting station there, and it was called the George E. Prentice Camp, I think it was, and it was set up just for recruiting. Specifically, I think it was in the direction of Luzerne as you go out of Greenville, but I don't know exactly. We can't find any records as to where it was actually set up, but that's where they gathered Union men for the Army.
Yeah. Well, George Prentice, he again finds his way into the podcast. We've talked about him
many
times.
He's an important figure.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Well, especially the 1850s to 60s.
Right.
Now. Yeah. Another issue, slavery obviously was a big topic for the Civil War. And how Muhlenberg County, what was it like there?
Well, I guess to talk about that, I'll kind of base this off of some research I did I have a friend, he recently passed away, his name's Howard Martin. And I'll give you some of the feedback that I got from him. He said, I'd like to write a book about my family. He's an African-American fellow, good friend of mine. They own about 1,000 acres around where I live now. I have a very small farm, a little dot on the edge of their farm, but he's a good friend of mine. I'd like to write a history of my family. And I said, I'll help you. So I took on the research part and tried to help him put this book together. And I shared stories in there about slavery in Muhlenberg County. And his family is very widespread all over the country. And they have these reunions. And as they gathered after reading the book, they told me they were blown away by the picture of how slavery operated in Muhlenberg County. Slavery is no good, was no good. It was wrong.
Yeah.
But it was a necessary evil that was left upon generations of people that had been brought in by pioneers. In Muhlenberg County, the slaves, their population was growing, as with any people. But they really didn't know most people didn't know what to do with them. You couldn't free a slave. Now, it sounds simple enough.
Yeah.
If I had a slave, if I was a slaveholder, that I could free a slave. I can't do that. If I respect that person, even as a slave, if I respect them as a human being, I can't free them, because as soon as they leave my protection, they're in trouble.
Yeah.
Somebody else is out here. There's like people out there picking them up, taking them south, putting them on plantations. There's places even nearby that they could be picked up and taken to and destroy their identities and restart. And they're enslaved again in a worse situation.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of freed slaves in Muhlenberg County long before the war started. And but on paper, they were still showing in the census as being slaves. But they were working as sharecroppers. I'm not trying to sugarcoat this, but I have documentation to show this.
Yeah.
Howard Martin said, Lorenzo Dow, my great grandfather, was a freed slave. And I said, well, I've got paperwork that shows that he was still enslaved. He said, no, he was freed about 1854. We know that. We know that. But he was still showing up as a slave for Charles Martin. And I can prove that he was a freed man, even though he's still a slave. He was a freed man because in 1867, when they got the right to vote, or got the right to be married, I'm sorry, not vote, right to be married, right to own land, his name appears early in the books. Immediately thereafter, shows his marriage. He had been married for some years, but now it's legal in the Muhlenberg County court records. He receives 100 acres of property, which is still part of that, about 1,000 acres, but he had 100 acres of property. And by 1870 in the census records, he was worth $800. He could read, he could write, he was well-dressed and had a nice photograph made. So he was a slave on paper. Now, I see that often. Charles Foxwing had a number of slaves that lived right across the road from him there in town. What are slaves going to do in town? They may do some shopping. They may fix the roof. He could hire them out to do some work. But he still had to feed them. He had to clothe them. They had jobs. They worked. Several of those guys. I mean, and it's interesting. In his family Bible, when his children were born, he put their names down in the information. When his slaves had children, their names went in the Bible. and he would put them there. It was a little bit different view.
Yeah.
On New Year's Day in Muhlenberg County, out where they used to have jockey behind the courthouse, and they've done it at the courthouse as well, they would bring their slave property, their slave workers. I've got 10 slaves. I don't need any of them. I don't need any of them. I may need one to help me do some work. And rather than me have to afford to take care of them for a season, I would lease them out to go work as a sharecropper to somebody out, that has a farm just out of town. And they would do that on New Year's Day. They would lease them out. And for a part of the crops, back to the slave owner and to the slave family themselves, they would do that. Edward Rumsey, at his death, his will reads, he says, "At my death, I'm leaving my slaves to my wife," and gives her information. He said, "Except for if my wife ever decides to remarry, I want my slaves to be taken back and given to my nephew." And then he cites, "Because I do not want my slaves to be disciplined by a stranger." And you share these stories and people are like, "That's not what they say on the news." Well, I'm telling you, that's how it was here. Not every one of them. And I know there was some abuse, and I know there was some bad things. Slavery was bad. But in Muhlenberg County, it was mostly different if you read the documents. And I've got several other sources just like that, and we could talk forever about it. But I'm very proud that I could uncover that. And the Martins came to me and they said, "This is beautiful. It's nothing like Gone with the Wind." And I said, "Yeah, you're right. It's nothing like it." So,
well, it is interesting to see how much research and the fact that you got those dates. How that played out. And I mean, if you got the documents of it, I mean, it makes sense. It makes perfect sense.
We had the Salisburys, the Oates. We had James Weir, the first merchant. He set up a community out in my neck of the woods called Rhodes Chapel. Built them a home. Freedom. And they moved out there, and they lived. And whenever after the war, after 1867, when they could own land, he deeded them the land. It was theirs. So
pretty interesting stuff. Now, the population of Muhlenberg County, how much? I know I might be putting you on spots, but slave-wise, 10%, or how much do you think it was during the, I guess, 50s to the 60s, or?
Well, let's do the math. Interesting. I do have those numbers here. The population in Muhlenberg in 1860 was 10,600. A little over 9,000 of that was white. About 1,500 there were blacks.
Okay.
And I have the number for freed slaves. I don't have it in front of me. Some of those were documented as freed slaves. But remember that not all of them could be called freed slaves
because
of the protection that they were able to take advantage of.
The laws and so forth. Well, so Muhlenberg's population, I mean, that goes right into the Civil War. How much of the Civil War population, I guess, the majority, 10%, you think? How many people fought?
About 10%. We had 1,000, the ones that I could find. And I got to explain that. Remember the sources, there's thousands of sources that you look at to find a soldier's name. And you'll find them in odd places. I may find a document that's all about a soldier. Let's say his name is Bob Reeves. And Bob Reeves has got this document, and down through there, and he mentions your name. And I'm like, wow, I just found another soldier that I can't find any other document. I pull that name in, and then I start doing the genealogical context, and my friend Cass looks at the military documents, and you had a soldier. I was able to, we as a group, 2 or 3 people sending me stuff, the ladies over at the library helped me, we were able to create a list of 1,044 soldiers that served from Muhlenberg. And I think that's going to be very short, because once you start looking at the documents, I would easily guess that I'm 10% off, 20% off. Records were lost.
Courthouses burned.
Yeah, all of that, and one of the greatest sources of information, and it just kills you to hear. People always say, "If I just had that 1890 census," There was a column in the 1890 census that a person could declare that they were a Union or a Confederate soldier. And there was a lot of soldiers that passed away between 1890 and again when they recounted 1910. Of course, they had 1900, but the next time they mentioned the soldiers, I think it was 1910. So there's 20 years there that soldiers died.
Wow.
So even the census records from up to 1910, 2030, you can get some names, but you still miss that big chunk around 1890. I would say there were probably closer to 1,500 soldiers, 1,500 soldiers from Muhlenberg, born, lived, or died.
Yeah.
But we were able to identify 1,044.
Okay. Do you think, and this is just another kind of question, do you think that's more or less about the same as the rest of the state, or, as far as percentage goes? Obviously, Lexington and Louisville is going to have more people.
Right. It's going to be based on population. I think Muhlenberg probably was pretty heavy. Now, I don't have the number. I wish I could tell you, but
that's a good question. I popped in the head there. Not to do county versus county.
But, right. If I ever do another county, I'll have the answer. But for now, I don't know.
I did want to mention that I was worried about having this conversation because Wednesday, the boys' Sweet 16 was going on.
Oh, yeah.
And Lincoln County won their game. And if Muhlenberg County would have won their game, we would have been, I don't know if we could have made it through the hour.
I would have had to brought a bayonet. We would have been, best of luck to you guys.
Yeah, well, it's 10:24, so it's 11:30-ish.
I hear it was a really good game, and I'm proud of our boys for making it, to the tournament, and but really wishing you guys the best of luck.
Well, we'll know here in the next hour how they
go.
But moving on, back on topic, oftentimes people in Civil War, the generals get the big names. But there's two generals you pointed out in your book that had connections to Muhlenberg County. Confederate General Simon Bolivar. Did I say that right? Bolivar?
I've heard it pronounced a whole lot of different ways. I just say Bolivar.
Yeah, Bolivar. Buckner. So we can start with him. What's his connection?
Well, Buckner, he's a Kentuckian. His father built an iron furnace out south of Greenville. Still stands. It's called the Buckner Churchill furnace. It's built, I guess, around 1830. And it operated successfully, except for the fact that there was poor transportation in and out. So it was very seasonal when they could move their iron product out. Buckner lived there for a few years before going away. And I think it's important to tell. I always love this. And if we want to get further into Muhlenberg County history at some point, but Buckner's dad, Buckner went to a church and studied in Greenville himself. General Buckner did. And he became friends with Charles Foxwing. We've mentioned Charles Foxwing. And then he was friends with everybody there. So he became Muhlenberg County himself as a boy. Now, Alny McLean, officer of the War of 1812, and he was surveyor that laid out Greenville. He had a couple of boys, and one of them he sent away to the military academy and studied. And the boy got there and he really didn't want to be there. So he wrote his dad after a couple of weeks. He said, "Dad, this isn't working out. I'm homesick, just a kid. I want to come home." Well, McLean and Buckner and Foxwing, and they're all, they're the people that's establishing Muhlenberg County during that era, sitting around. And Buckner's dad, Elliot Buckner, said, "Can you write a letter on behalf of Simon and see if he can have," because it's kind of a tough place to get into, "can he have his spot?" So essentially, Alny McLean of Muhlenberg County wrote a letter on behalf of Simon Buckner and got him into the institute. So he studied military tactics. He was a good student. All of those guys were. I mean, a lot of the generals, Confederate and Union, they were all friends. They went through school together. But Buckner went to school there, and from there, Buckner served in the Mexican War. He left the military for a brief period before the Civil War, thinking that he wanted to be involved in civil work, and it just didn't work out for him. And when the war came along, he's like, "Aha, let's fight a war." He was offered a position as an officer in the Union Army, but he went with the South. So Buckner took a position. He was actually placed in charge of the Kentucky State Guard at that point, which is a counter to the Home Guard, or vice versa. I always get the two kind of twisted there, but the Home Guard, I think, was the Union based, and the State Guard became more of a Confederate based. See, people have their opinions, and they keep overflowing into these different areas.
Yeah.
But he was pretty successful of that, and so he became quite an officer. He's known for a couple of things. One, he was the first Confederate general or ranking general to surrender his post. He surrendered at Fort Donelson.
Yeah.
And you remember when Grant sent over his papers. Now, he'd even loaned money to Grant when Grant was drinking and having a hard time between the Mexican War and the Civil War, and thought they were pretty tight. But when Grant told him, you're going to have to surrender, what are the conditions?
That changes things.
You know, I mean, when Buckner asked him what are the conditions, and Grant said nothing but unconditional surrender. So that's, I kind of get my names twisted up.
Yeah.
But you see what happened there. Yeah. And Buckner's like, oh my goodness, look, I thought we were buddies. Yeah. But he went away as a prisoner of war and was exchanged some later time and went back into the field as a general. And he's also known as the last general to surrender his command. Mm-hmm. He held out and was in the South in some days or weeks after the war had pretty well wound down, and he was the last Confederate general to surrender his post. So Buckner was the first and the last general to surrender, oddly enough. He became governor of Kentucky. He ran on the ticket to be vice president at some point. He campaigned in Muhlenberg County, visited often, and so he's one of us at that point.
Yeah, he's definitely become part of it, definitely, and I'm trying to think of right off the top of my head what governor he was, but it would have had to have been in 80s, maybe 1880 something.
Yeah. And that brings up another item. I know we're talking about the generals, but you read the notes and they say, interestingly enough, without getting into politics, I avoid that subject.
It's probably best to.
But after the war, there wasn't an office held by anyone other than a Confederate general or Confederate officer in Kentucky or in some states in the South for decades.
Yeah.
Confederate officers were voted in unanimously in some situations. Yeah. Lincoln didn't even carry Kentucky in either election.
It says something right there.
He got 11 votes or in the 2 votes in the first election, 11 in the second in Muhlenberg.
Yeah.
In Muhlenberg.
Wow. Well, before we move on, I do want to. We got Russ Carson Jr. Hey, Russ. He's watching from Ireland. He is from Madison County, Kentucky. He has a genealogy service, Family Tree Nuts, history and genealogy. You can check it out. But Russ has to come here to Davis County because this library is full of Kentucky history, genealogy, all that stuff.
I love this place.
It's nice. But thanks for watching, Russ. Have fun on your vacation. So the other general, the Union general, Don Carlos Buell. Right?
Yes. He actually had a family connection there, and he didn't live there until after the war. The easiest way to describe it, if anybody knows anything about music, you hear John Prine sing his song Paradise. It says we'd shoot pop bottles and, up on Adrie Hill, and it was an empty old prison, wasn't a prison. There were some prisoners held there. But Buell in 1866 actually leased the land of the Iron Baron Robert Alexander, a wealthy Scottish man. He was born in Kentucky too, but he had built this iron smelting facility right there on Green River called Adrie. It's just right down the river from Paradise. And so Buell leased all the land, and it was about, I can't remember, 20,000 acres or something like that. And started, he wanted to drill for oil and mine coal. And some other issues arose as far as the maintenance on the river, and the state turned it over to a private entity, and you couldn't move product. I mean, we could go on and on. But Buell lived there for 32 years. He lived in the old house built by the McLeans in the 1820s, and it was his home. I mean, he gardened there. He loved. They said it was a real show place. People visited. They'd come from all over because it was so beautiful, sitting there on the banks of the Green River. And he died there after 32 years in 1898. And now, I mentioned another shameless plug. The undertaker in Greenville is Orion Roark, and Orion actually ran the J.L. Roark estate. He was the first. His dad was the first undertaker. But in Roark's building there in Greenville's where my son has his coffee shop and is selling these books and all this. But from there, Roark was asked to go to Adria and do the work there. So, on Buell. So he actually goes up to the Buell house and does the work on Buell's body right there in Buell's own bed. Wow. Once he's done, they carry him down to the river, put him on the mail boat from Paradise and take him to Rockport, load him on the train and haul him to St. Louis where he's actually buried. Wow. But he was one of us for 32 years. He would wear his uniform into town. he would ride to Paradise or over to Rockport, and he would put his uniform on and ride in. And they said it was a really cool sight. People that could remember back then, and they said the kids would line up along the sidewalk and salute him as he rode by. And I guess he had some eccentricities to be like that. But if you read some of his writings and stuff, he was a good guy, very smart.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you mentioned earlier how the Confederate generals are pretty much were elected everywhere, but he was a Union man strolling around with his uniform on.
That's right.
Not stepping down. I guess.
In Greenville, they called him our old general. They tried to get him involved in politics, and he said, "None of that for me." But they locked his room up. This is interesting too. After his embalming that night, they locked his room, left his books, his clothes, his bedding, and everything just like it was. And it was locked up, I think, for 8 or 10 years. His stepdaughter Nanny Mason then I think had moved on, and somebody broke in there and ripped through a bunch of the stuff, took some things. Most of his collection I think is housed at the Filson Club.
Okay.
And but I'm fortunate to have a few binders full of his handwritten work. So
that's pretty cool. Yeah. Well, you mentioned being a show house and stuff, and I just kind of think back, like, that's what people probably did around that time. That was an extra go to somebody's big, nice, fancy house. And I sit there and think that, man, that's I would not want a bunch of strangers coming to my house.
No. Well, I mean, people were social people then. They were face-to-face people. Generations now are different, Yeah. It's easier to send a text, but back then you would go horseback riding, and he loved working his garden. Yeah. And he had beautiful flower gardens and trees, and so he was an interesting fella.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I really appreciate you coming on here. I think it's your book is really good. There's one thing I do want to bring up real quickly. While I was looking in some of the records in the back, there's a list of every soldier from Muhlenberg County in the book. There is a Benjamin, Samuel, William, and Wyatt Duvall.
Yeah.
Is there a connection to those?
There is. We're descended from a fellow by the name of Benjamin Skinner Duvall. My son wanted to name one of his kids Skinner so bad. My daughter-in-law wasn't open-minded to the idea, but my son is Benjamin, actually named after Benjamin Skinner, and carries the namesake of him, which also the Benjamin that you're mentioning there by the same name. But they are relatives. The Benjamin that you mentioned there is actually a brother to my great-great-grandfather. Samuel, I can't remember which one. I remember an old fella told me when I was living down closer to Bremen, down the Cherry Hill area, down around Giston, an old fella was down there, and his name was Ellis Riley. And he was very knowledgeable. And he said, "I'll tell you a story, young fella. You like history?" He said, "You ever heard about the guy that died in my house up there?" And I'm like, "Oh no, this kind of stuff." I'm probably 11 or 12. I'm like, "Tell me." And he said his name was Duvall, and I think it's the Samuel Duvall you mentioned. It's one of these. And said he was at Camp Calhoun and got very sick, and so he made his way home, which is it's hard during wintertime. Yeah. Made his way home, and he was improving, but said. Some of his buddies rode into town here on top of the hill at my house, and I know right where it is. And he said, and they didn't get off their horses. They just rode by and kind of made a quick stop to see how he's doing. So he came out on the front porch, and it was very cold, and he got sicker and he died, like of pneumonia from exposure. And I always thought, how cool, Duvall. And I figured out who he was. And I can't say right off which one he is there, but it was cool. Some of my favorite topics in any history situation are the ones that make these big circles. You know, you get a little article here, a little writing here, and I put them in these folders, and all of a sudden I'm reading something else, and everything ties together.
Yeah.
And so I can put it in one printed form. So the goal for the book was to put it all in one piece, and hopefully there aren't very many copies of it printed. My son actually paid to have it done. He finished it, and I think I had him look, and I think there's 30 books left.
Oh, wow.
So, and they won't be reprinted.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that the first thing, I did when I started looking at those the soldiers' names is I went to cable, see if there's any cables in there. And then I went to cash. Is there any caches? And then Gentry and Hendrickson, just trying to find any.
Right.
However, didn't find any.
Well, we're all one and the same. Somewhere we can tie together.
Oh yeah. That's the way the migration went from east to west. Any last things before we sign off here? Any questions? Anything? Good. Everybody's good. Well, thanks again for coming on. We'll have you on again for sure to talk more Muhlenberg County history, more Civil War. I can sit here for hours and talk. But, we got other people that's going to be coming on. Shameless plug on my end. If you are watching and you've not subscribed to the YouTube channel, just type in Kentucky History Channel. It'll be the first thing that pops up. If you want to subscribe to the podcast, we put podcasts out every Sunday about Kentucky history from Pikeville to Ballard. So anything Kentucky history is good. We're trying to do all the county histories. And that's about it, I guess. Thanks, everybody, for watching. Thank you again for coming on. We'll do it hopefully soon.
Yes, thank you.
And talk some more. And remember, Kentucky History Podcast, we're trying to tell stories about Kentucky that, people won't forget. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Well, actually, here in a few minutes, we'll come back on live with another guest. So stay tuned, I guess would be a better way to say. So thank you. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you. The viewers, the listeners, we want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.